In this video, we're going to look at how to use for loops in JavaScript. A for loop is a type of loop that can repeat a set of instructions in a block of code a set number of times. For example, you could use a for loop with a built-in counter to repeat a set of instructions 10 times or 20 times, depending on what you set the counter to. So it can be used to repeat blocks of code a certain number of times. However, they're even more useful than that. They are often used to go through a list of items. For example, if you create an array of numbers or strings or any type of value, you can use a for loop to go through each item or each element in that array and process each element individually. You might have an array of different values and you want to display them in a list on a web page. You could use a for loop to go through each element in the array and display each element as a dot point on a list. So for loops are used for repeating blocks of code a certain number of times, but also for going through different data structures like arrays, going through elements in an array individually one by one, or even going through individual characters in a string, such as every letter in a word or a sentence. So we're going to look at how to create a basic for loop in this tutorial, and then in the next tutorial we're going to look at how to use for loops to go through arrays, each element in an array, and also how to use for loops to go through each character in a string. Okay, so a for loop looks like this. We use the keyword for, and then in parentheses there are 3 parameters. The first parameter is the counter. So that tells the for loop to where to start counting from. And this counter, we can call it whatever you like, but often it's called I, which stands for index. So we set the counter to where we want to start counting from, for example 0, then a semicolon, and the second parameter is the condition that we want to test, the condition that needs to evaluate to true for this loop to repeat code. Alright, so if we wanted this loop to count from 0 and then stop when it gets up to 10, then we might set the condition to be I is less than 10. And then the third parameter is how much we want this counter to increase by each time the loop runs. So if we say I++, that would mean that the counter, I, is going to go up by 1 every time the loop repeats. Every repetition of the loop is called an iteration of the loop. So every time the loop repeats, that is an iteration of the loop. Once we close the parentheses, we can then put in our curly brackets, and that's the code that's going to be in our loop. So we might just test that out by logging the value I to the console. Okay, so just to go through that one more time, we say for, and then between these parentheses we have 3 parameters separated by semicolons. The first one is a variable that's going to act as a counter in this loop. Alright, I stands for index here, and I is just the name of the variable that's going to act as a counter in each iteration of the loop. Alright, again we can call this something else. We could call it counter if we wanted to. We would just have to make sure that we refer to that counter everywhere else here and inside the loop as well. Okay, I'm going to leave it as I though, so I'll just change that back. Alright, so that's the first parameter, that's the counter being set. Second parameter, that's the condition that needs to be true for this loop, the block of code in the loop to run, and every time the loop repeats it's going to check if that condition is still true. And then lastly, this parameter here is the increment, how much the counter in the loop is going to increase by each time the loop runs. Alright, so let's test that out. If we go to, and we might just actually display, before we test it out, just a little goodbye message when the loop breaks or ends, just to see that the loop has ended. If we go back and refresh the page, there we see the numbers or digits 0 to 9 because our loop started counting from 0 and the counter I increases each time the loop runs, and once it gets up to 10, the loop is going to stop because the condition is that for the loop to repeat, the counter needs to be less than 10. All right, we could count from 1 if we wanted to, and we could stop at 11, or we could say I is less than or equal to 10, and refresh if we wanted it to count from 1 to 10. Okay, so one thing to notice here is that to create a for loop, you have to provide these 3 different parameters. You have to have a counter, you have to have a condition, and you have to set the increment for the counter. So when you are wanting to repeat a block of code a set number of times, this can actually be a safer method than using a while loop, because to create a for loop, you have to set a counter and you have to set the condition for when the loop will stop. So it's much more difficult to create an infinite loop. All right, if we created a while loop and we said make the loop repeat until, or while I is less than or equal to 10, but then in the loop we forgot to increase I, we would have an infinite loop. All right, we'd run into that problem. It's much harder to do that in a for loop because we have to specify the counter and the increment and the condition for that loop to repeat. All right, so at the moment this might not look too useful. It's just repeating instructions a set number of times, but for loops become really useful when we can use them to go through all of the elements in an array or all of the characters in a string if we need to process them or perform some kind of task or set of instructions on those. All right, so that's what we're going to look at in the next video. Thanks for watching.